Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our inaugural event for Creating Conversations with Literary Women. We are very excited to have you all here and very encouraged by the fact that almost 300 of you registered for tonight's event. So thank you for doing that. I'm Terry Gilman of Creating Conversations. You may recognize me from the festival. We are your pop-up bookstore at Literary Women of Long Beach. And we have been your partner for almost 9 years, I believe. We value our relationship with Literary Women of Long Beach, and that is actually what has led to this event tonight, is this wonderful partnership. Barbara Wild is the chair of Literary Women and would also like to welcome you and introduce our guests. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Terry. Hi, I'm Barbara Wild, and I am chair of Literary Women, and you do know us because we do put on that festival annually where we get to meet in person with everybody and have a good time listening to authors. Today is a little different, but thanks to technology and our partnership, our collaboration with Creating Conversations, we are able to bring you Elizabeth Wetmore, who's going to be talking about her stunning debut novel, Valentine. She will be in conversation with Pam Atherton, who I will tell you about in just a moment. We at Literary Women value two things above all. One, supporting authors, and two, supporting independent bookstores. Today, with your help, we're able to do both. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to tell you about Pamela Atherton. Pam is an award-winning radio TV personality. She counts among her guests Madeleine Albright, Leslie Stahl, just to mention a couple. She's also a workshop leader and a keynote speaker and strongly believes in women. She moderates panels that speak to her heart. Very talented, and we are lucky to have her. So Pam, I'm going to give this to you.
Thank you so much. A big thank you to Creating Conversations and Literary Women. As you said, this is a new way to connect, and that is very exciting that we're doing it this way. I have some housekeeping things to go through while we start, before we go. And the first one is, feel free to leave your comments in the chat box. It's right over there, and some of you have already been leaving comments and things. That's great. We will have questions at the end, and for that, we will use the Q&A. So if you have a question for Elizabeth, or as she likes us to call her, Beth, then please put it in the Q&A. But if you want to comment or you want to chat with others, please use the chat box. We won't be using the raise your hand function, so just know that that's going to be ignored. If you don't have a book, then you can purchase one from Creating Conversations bookstore. And Terry, if you don't mind putting that in the chat box so everybody can see that. And by the way, Terry and Beth conspired to get us some signed book plates. While they're limited and while they last, when you order a book from Creating Conversations, you'll also get a signed book plate from Beth. After the event, you're going to be getting an email where you will have the opportunity to sign up for the newsletter for Literary Women, and also to email them if you have any input, any questions, or any suggestions, or people that you'd like to connect them with. So if you'd also like to get a hold of them, you can do that through the email that you will get after the program. And because this is a live broadcast, you may hear some dogs barking and some cats walking across keyboards and doorbells ringing. That is the beauty of live broadcasting. It's real life in real time. So today we look forward to having a conversation and a lot of laughs with Beth Wetmore. Let me introduce you to Beth. She has done it all. She's waited tables and driven cabs. She's painted silos at petrochemical plants and been a classical musical announcer, and she's taught English. She also is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts. And now she can proudly add to her bio a New York Times best-selling author with her debut novel, Valentine. And I must tell you, that is a remarkable achievement as a debut to come out on a New York Times best-selling list. She's a native of West Texas, Odessa, but she skedaddled right from that area when she was 18 years old on her way to a new life. So why does she go back there to write this book in Valentine? We'll find out. We couldn't be more thrilled to have Beth as our guest for Creating Conversations and Literary Women, and I'm personally excited to be part of the conversation. So Beth, welcome, and thank you for your time with us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Pam. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for being in conversation with me. It's really an honor to meet you. And thank you to Literary Women for having me, and Terry Gilman of Creating Conversations. You know, I didn't have a sort of traditional path. I left home young and spent several years working before I made it to college. And in those years, librarians and independent booksellers were really my college professors. They were my literary advisors. So I had been a kid who loved to read, but hadn't had a lot of focus or a lot of guidance. And so, you know, I could walk into a bookstore in Venice Beach and mention that I had read, you know, James Baldwin's, you know, If Beale Street Could Talk, right? And an independent bookseller could say to me, well, if you love that, you should check out his beautiful, perfect, you know, debut novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. So independent booksellers have been incredibly important to me, and I'm so grateful to be here. And then finally, thank you to all of you who have joined us. It's a delight to be here. So I'm sad that I can't be with you in person, but something I've thought a lot about in recent weeks has been that, you know, this is also an opportunity, right? There are probably people in the audience tonight who would not have been able to attend this if we had met in person, and I'm so happy you're here. So thank you.
Okay, well, we're thrilled to have you. So I know Terry has already put in the chat box how to get the book. So for those of you who do not have it yet, you may do that. But for those who do, great, you're going to know a lot of what we're talking about. But for those who don't, they're not perhaps familiar with the story, Beth. So give us a little rundown of the journey the book takes us through.
Sure. The book is set in 1976. It begins on the morning after Valentine's Day in the oil patch city of Odessa, Texas, and it explores the aftermath of a vicious crime against a 14-year-old Mexican-American girl and its lingering effects on her and her family, as well as the other women and girls in town. The story is told through the voices of 7 characters, among them an old woman who thinks she's made all the big decisions she's going to make, a young girl whose mother has left town without her, a waitress who hopes to make a better life for herself and her young daughter, and Glory Ramirez, the teenage girl who's struggling not to let one terrible moment define the rest of her life.
So let me ask you, I recognize that the story opens on Valentine's Day, but you named the book Valentine, and I didn't see a whole lot of chocolate and champagne in the book. Why did you name it Valentine?
Yeah, you know, it was, I had other titles and none of them had ever felt quite right. And there were a couple of things going on there. The first was that it occurred to me it occurred to me at some point that several of the men in the book use the word Valentine to refer to the girls and the women. And I was interested in kind of taking that, you know, away from them and sort of putting it in the voices of the girls and women. And then of course, there's the fact that the book starts, you know, right after Valentine's Day. And then finally, I started to think of kind of the old-fashioned, you know, view of a Valentine. A Valentine is a love letter. And so while this book isn't, you know, always the happiest or the easiest book, you know, and can be, you know, take a pretty unflinching look at my hometown, I really did see this book as a love letter to my hometown and to West Texas and to the women and girls who grew up there and who live there still.
So let's talk about that, because you couldn't wait to leave when you were 18 with what, $200 in your pocket or something?
Yeah, yeah.
You know? So why was this the book that you wrote about? Why come back to it?
Yeah, you know, that's such a good question. I think that, you know, without sounding too cheesy, you know, there are books that we have to write. You know, I had spent my entire adult life hearing the voices of the women and girls I had grown up with in my head and recalling conversations I'd heard growing up on a street very much like Larkspur Lane. And, you know, while initially I did not want to write about my hometown at all, it became clear to me at some point that I had to write this book. And once I made that decision, you know, I was kind of off to the races. And also, you know, while I left my hometown at 18, I still have family there. So I've always gone back a couple of times a year and, you know, and watched the town go through, you know, several incarnations of the kind of oil boom and bust cycles that are of such interest to me.
So the book is not a Western by any stretch of the imagination, but it takes place in West Texas. It has the feel that a Western has in it. And all the Westerns pretty much that we've read are about these heroic men and the women who supported them. And this is not. This is about women and their strength. Explain that. Were you inspired at any point in time or led into this because of Westerns?
Yeah, there was a period of time when I was a young woman where I really, really fell in love with the genre of the Western. And while I didn't set out initially to sort of, you know, subvert the Western or to kind of take the Western and sort of put it in the hands of women and girls, there really did become a moment where I realized and was conscious of using some of the tropes of the Western. So for example, there are tons of guns in Valentine, right? But they're all in the hands of the women and girls, right? You know, the stories of the men, you know, tend to be sort of, you know, at the edges of the focus of the story, and the story is sort of wholeheartedly, you know, in the voices of the women and girls. You know, there's a kind of rough justice that's often associated with the Western. You know, the kind of sense that justice doesn't come through, say, the legal system, but that, you know, people, you know, take it in their own hands. And so all of those things were things that I became aware of, but not at first. I was several drafts into the book before I really started to think about that.
Yeah, well, it comes through, and the strength of the women comes through, and they're not perfect women by any stretch of the imagination, but we see them as real people, and we can identify with so many different parts of them. And I think that is what truly makes it a good Western, if you will, without the heroic man and the supporting woman. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's great. And by the way, Friday Night Lights was written about Odessa, and you have a personal connection with that.
Yes, my sister went to the high school. She was in that graduating class when that book was written. So, you know, I got to hear about. I was gone by then, but yeah, you know, when he was there, you know, doing research for the book. You know, it was a big deal. You know, so and I actually relied on his book quite a bit in the early stages of writing Valentine. It's such a well-researched piece of writing. You know, like a lot of books that come out of West Texas, you know, in Bissinger's books, as in some fiction, you know, I missed the presence of complicated women and girls stories, you know, so it's not a criticism of the book. It's not what he was setting out to do, but, you know, it was noticeable to me.
Well, but if anybody is from West Texas or Eastern New Mexico, you know that football is the end all be all. When I'm originally from Los Angeles, and when I moved to Eastern New Mexico, there were 3 radio stations that carried the high school football games. And I was shocked because nobody carried them here, but that's how intrinsic it is. And I think that also supports that male orientation that you took us away from and said, hey, there were women there too.
Right. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that in the oil economy, you know, an oil patch is a very male dominated, you know, working environment, even now, and particularly back in 1976, you don't see a lot of female roughnecks even today, you know, so the whole economy, the high school football, the, you know, the kind of harshness of the terrain, all of that, you know, really sort of tends to focus the attention on men and boys.
Yeah. Well, and you took a very difficult way to present the story through the voices of I think it's 7 different women with different points of view, that some were third person, some were first person. I mean, that's very difficult to do. How did you come to that decision?
That's such a good question. Mary Rose's section is the only section that's in first person, and I knew right away that her sections would be in first person. The rest of the decisions I made, honestly, I make these decisions intuitively, and I also make them by sound. I read a lot of poetry, and when I teach fiction workshops and people ask, how should I write fiction? How do you get better at writing fiction? I always say, read more poetry and also read your work aloud. So I read aloud constantly, and I really make all of these decisions based on how it sounds to me, how the character's voice sounds to me. So, and I had some sections that I changed. I had one chapter that was in a second person. And I made a decision at some point that I was already asking a lot of a reader with 7 different points of view, and really a pretty short novel, and so I made some decisions based on, how much I was asking the reader to sort of jump around between points of view. So.
Well, and it's a very difficult thing to do because every one of us who had an English teacher told us you write in one perspective and it's better be third person,
Right.
I mean, pretty much. And here you are all over the place, but we're able to follow along. So how did you keep organized?
Well, I worked on the book for a very long time, from start to finish. I worked on the book on and off for about 14 years. Um, and each of these women and girls came to me in turn. When you work on a book for that long, the world changes, but you change as well, and so one of the things that happened in my life was I became a parent, and once I became a mother, the lives of some of these characters really came into much sharper focus for me. I was able to understand these mothers' love for their daughters in a different way. I was able to view them through a much more compassionate lens. You're right, they are terribly flawed, every single one of them.
Right.
I mean, and some of them pretty deeply flawed, there are a couple of characters, for example, who are never able to rise above their own, the racism of their time and place. So I worked on them each in turn, but the things that happened in my life and in the world as I was writing the book really changed the way I saw these characters as well.
So can we go through some of the characters?
Sure.
All right, let's do that. Let's start with Gloria, who by the end of the book's name is Glory, and I don't want to give anything away unless you do, and it's up to you if you choose to. But tell us about her and any of the struggles that you may have had in working with her.
Yeah. So in a lot of ways for me, Glory is truly the hero of this book. And I've been in a lot of talks where people focus their attention on Mary Rose and everything that she does to help Glory in the early pages of the book. But to me, Glory is really the hero of the book. She's 14 years old. She's Mexican American. Her mother is an undocumented worker. Her uncle is also a U.S. citizen who sort of earned his citizenship by serving in the Vietnam War. And in the opening pages, as the book opens, she has made the horrible mistake of getting into the truck with the wrong man, and she has survived this rather vicious assault. So as the book opens, she is basically saving her own life. For me, she was the hardest character to write, hands down. And there were all kinds of reasons for that. Part of it is the sort of viciousness of the crime. I was incredibly mindful of the sort of ethics of, as a writer, of asking a reader to witness this kind of suffering in the opening pages of the book. I was mindful of not wanting to exploit, right, this crime, to treat this crime as nothing more than a way to get my novel moving, right? But most importantly, her life was so very different from mine. Right. I grew up on a street very much like Larkspur Lane in a deeply segregated Odessa in the 1970s. And Glory's experience, her family were completely different from mine. So I was nervous, about whether or not I could do justice to her story and treat it with the kind of complicated nature that it deserved to be treated. So yeah, she's the one that I struggled with her more than anyone. And to this day, she's probably the character I'm most worried that maybe I didn't quite get it right,
But, like actresses, right, and actors, writers have to inhabit the people they are creating. And so you also have to be so aware of people around you that you pick up on things that are able to create that character. And I found it to be, I grew up in a Hispanic neighborhood. I found it to be very realistic.
Yeah.
So I don't think you have anything to worry about, but I respect the fact that you did worry about it.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, I think we're having a lot of good conversations right now, conversations that are long overdue, and conversations that we white folks are having that other folks have been having for a really long time.
Oh, yeah.
And these are important conversations. Something I come back to again and again as a fiction writer is that you never want to diminish the capacity for imagination and compassion and empathy, and particularly as an artist, you're always trying to access your sort of, your best self, right? And bring that to your characters.
Okay, so let's move to Mary Rose, who is probably the most courageous because she has to combat not only her feelings, but the feelings of the entire town to do something that nobody wanted her to do.
Yeah, Mary Rose is great. Again, she was the first voice I really heard clearly in this book. And, she's 25 years old as this novel opens. She's a cattle rancher's wife in this farmhouse that's way outside of town, very isolated. She has a 9-year-old daughter and another child on the way. So like a lot of characters in Valentine, she's a very young mother, 25, and already her daughter's 9. And the question that I was interested in with Mary Rose was, what do you do when a wounded stranger knocks on your door, right, seeking help? Even and do you open that door? And having opened that door, what is your responsibility to that stranger? And what is your responsibility to yourself, to your own family? Mary Rose was so interesting to me because she's a character whose conscience is shocked in the opening pages of this book, and so while she's been, raised in the same kind of racist environment as all the other white characters in this book, there's something about seeing this young girl on her front porch, right, and the damage that's been done that shocks her conscience, and it changes her. And it makes her act in ways that are more courageous than she probably could ever have imagined for herself. And I love that. I mean, I think this is something that all of us, can kind of understand, this idea that you don't think of yourself as particularly courageous, right? But we all have these moments in our life, however big or however small, when we're really asked to make these decisions about how we'll be in the world. And for her, it cost her, almost everything, right? By the end of this book, she's the character that I'm still most worried about, actually, so yeah.
And I think too that when we see courage in others, it makes us more courageous. And
Sure.
I think we did see that about people like Corinne. And Corinne, I have to say, I think she's one of your favorites because I hear you talk about her a lot.
Yes.
And I love some of the things that you have said about her. She's got one of my favorite lines in the whole book. But talk about Corinne because she doesn't end up the way she started out.
Yeah. Well, in my part of West Texas, we would pronounce her name Corrine, like rhymes with Jolene. Corrine. Corrine Shepherd. And I'm going to tell you, she was the biggest surprise in this book for me. And what a joyful surprise. I had imagined her through about 4 complete drafts of the book. I had imagined her as a very, very minor character. An old woman who was kind of cantankerous and who stepped across the street occasionally and knocked on Mary Rose's door to deliver a piece of news that could move my plot along. I did not see her as a major character in this book at all. And in fact, I had several sections written from her husband's point of view. And when I decided that, I was going to have all the sections from women and girls, points of view, I was trying to figure out what to do with Potter. And I found myself wondering about Corrine. And once that happened, and I really started to ask myself questions about her life and who she was and what her situation was, she really just rose up off the page. And she's a great character. I mean, as this book opens, she's a character whose husband has recently died. And, and like a lot of couples that have been together for a very long time, there's sometimes the the part of the person in the couple who keeps them tethered to the world. They're the joyful part of the couple. They're the people who are always inviting people over. And then there's the cranky part of the couple. And Potter was her tether to the world. He was her tether to joy. So when this book opens and he's died, you know, she sees herself as a character who has nothing left to give to the world and doesn't particularly want to, you know, so she's kind of holed up in her house across the street, basically drinking and smoking and sort of waiting for the sweet hereafter, you know. And of course that's wrong, right? You know, of course she hasn't made all the big decisions, you know, until they carry you out the back door in the pine box, right? There's always time to change. And she does. And I love her so dearly in this book.
With her best friend, Jack. She spends her time. Jack Daniels, you know him.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting because, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but when this becomes a movie, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, that's the character everyone's going to clamor to be, because she's just, you know, wonderful. And I sat there the whole time going, I could do this character. I could do it. It's me. So it's really a fun, fleshed out, changed character that's wonderful. And part of her being changed is Deborah Ann.
Right.
You know, yeah. So let's talk about Deborah Ann, who is the same age you were during that period of time.
Yes, Deborah Ann is the character that I really drew from my own life. I was about 10 years old in 1976. And so, you know, I was able to really, you know, mine my own memories of the street where I grew up, which Larkspur Lane is very much based on. So much so that when my dad read the book, he said he totally recognized everything, you know, the drainage ditch, everything. But Deborah Ann and Corinne both, they do a lot in the book, but one of the things I think they most do is they inject a fair amount of levity into a book that's not terribly happy in a lot of ways, and is kind of a difficult book. So that levity, I think, was welcome for me as the writer. But Deborah Ann is 10 years old. Her mom, another very young mother, has decided that this is not the life she wants, and she has left town and left her daughter behind. Her father is working in the oil patch in the midst of a, you know, coming oil boom, so he's never home. And so basically she's kind of this like about half feral child who just sort of wanders around Larkspur Lane getting into all kinds of trouble, but also in the way that this comes up again and again in this book, you know, helping to save Corinne, right? You know, looking in on this old woman. You know, there's a moment where Corinne thinks that, you know, Deborah Ann is asking her for something, and she's never really aware of how much she, you know, the child is actually doing for her. So, and she was a great character to write, you know, because she had so much freedom of movement, you know, and this is set in 1976, and I didn't anticipate the joy I would get in writing from during a time when there were no cell phones, you know, when you know, when the phone service could be knocked out in a windstorm, right? When characters could, and especially children, could disappear for a few hours and be really truly alone and on their own. And it was such a joy to write that.
Well, and I think she's also the moral conscience of the book, right, when you take a look at the good that she did for Corinne, and then also for Jesse Belden. And this is like a weird out of nowhere. You think you know everybody, you think you know what's going on, and all of a sudden we meet Jesse. And he brings a whole nother level to this book that doesn't have to do with the story at hand, the rape particularly. It has to do with people and kindness. And I think that's critical. So tell us a little bit about Jesse.
Yeah, Jesse's great. There are a lot of veterans in my book, and actually there are a lot of veterans in all my work. I have a real soft spot for veterans. My dad was a veteran. He was a medic in Vietnam from 69 to 71. And he came home from the war and immediately went to work in the petrochemical plant in my hometown, where he worked for the next 35 years. And that's very dangerous work. You know, I have very clear memories of the phone ringing in the middle of the night and my dad getting up and going out to the plant because there'd been an explosion or an accident or a chemical spill, you know, and having to deal with injuries and, you know, traumatic amputations and stuff like that. So of course I didn't think about this as a little girl, but as a woman, I've often found myself musing on this idea of surviving a war right? And the horrors of a war, and then coming home and spending the rest of your working life, working in a really dangerous, industry that in some ways was kind of like its own sort of daily battle, right? And then Jesse, is a young man who's come home from the war like John, but his home was in Eastern Tennessee, and he comes back in the 70s and returns to a hometown where there are no jobs and no real prospects for him. And like a lot of young men at that time, he makes his way to West Texas thinking he's going to make a lot of money in the oil boom. And this was something I witnessed a lot as a kid. In an oil boom, the whole town would fill up with these young men from all over the country, without a lot of skills, without a lot of education, without a lot of money or resources, who came to Odessa to make money, right? And Jesse's, so he comes to Odessa, but he's got all this sort of unresolved trauma from the war, at a time when, we weren't really talking about that in ways that we do now, I think. And so he's living very close to the bone. He's very much a character standing at the margins and incredibly vulnerable. And you're right, Deborah Ann in that regard is kind of the moral conscience of the book, because she, cares for him, right? But this is for me, this is a theme all through the book, is how do we care for each other, right? I'm very interested in characters who don't have a lot of education or a lot of money or a lot of power, and the way they find to care for one another's and the dignity of their lives, right? That their lives have dignity and worth and value, and are the stuff of art making, right? The stuff of beauty. And so, and for me, Jesse was very much a character who kind of went to the heart of that. So.
And I think that you also point out to us that small kindnesses matter. Right. Her bringing a sandwich or whatever, and right. That we tend to think we're not going to do something because it's not big enough. We're not doing enough. But those small little kindnesses mean a lot. And she's proof of that. Deborah Ann is with Jesse.
Yeah, and you see that all through the book a couple of times with Glory, yeah, I mean, I think, I'm a pretty average person and a bit of a hermit, and I don't think of myself as being particularly heroic ever. And I think a lot of us are like that, and, and at a time like this, we're all making decisions every day, when we're all afraid, right? And maybe feeling small and feeling like that we don't have a lot of control over our lives. And yet we make these decisions every day. And some of them can be the tiniest bits of kindness that make all the difference in the world to other people in ways that we'll never even know, right? And you see a lot of that in the book, that, characters doing kind things and never really seeing the fruition of that, right? Because that's not why you do it, right? You do it right. Because, we're all sort of traveling through this adventure together, so.
Yeah. Did you find at a certain point in time that some of the characters took over and wrote themselves and maybe didn't even go in the direction you were expecting to go?
Practically all of them. No, I'm serious. This book went through so many drafts, and it was so different from, the early drafts. And part of that is because while all the characters in this book were very loosely based on women and girls I knew growing up, every single one of them, draft by draft, right, the fiction kicks in. And so, yeah, all of these characters, and in fact, I think for me, that's a requirement, right? If a character doesn't at some point rise up off the page, then I'm probably doing something wrong. I'm probably not creating a very good character. I think I think it was Faulkner who said when he was talking about writing The Sound and the Fury, and he was talking about how there's a moment in which the characters just rise up off the page, and after that the writer is just kind of running along behind them, right, trying to get down everything they say and everything they do, and and everything that motivates them. And I feel like that about all my characters and all my work, really.
Yeah, you think you're going one way and the character takes you somewhere else.
Yeah, and you got to listen to them, right? I mean, if you've created real characters, that are complicated and nuanced and have their own dreams and hopes and fears, then they should be doing that at some point, and you got to get out of the way, right? That's the wisdom, is knowing when to get out of the way.
You are an inspiration for so many of us. And girlfriend, can I say how old you are?
Yes, please do. I have earned every one of my years.
Beth is 52. This is her debut novel. So for anyone who has been thinking, oh, it's too late for me to start this career, it's too late for me to start this project or whatever, you are living proof that that is just not the case. Did you always know you wanted to be an author, or did it come to you later in life? How did that work?
It came to me later in life. I don't think I wrote my first short story until I was in my late 20s. I was a child and a young woman who loved books. I loved stories. I think I could make a pretty good argument that books saved my life. As a young girl growing up in Odessa, it's a pretty rough and tumble environment. And, books were my escape. They were my way of seeing that the world wasn't the same everywhere else as it was in my hometown. But I don't think it ever really occurred to me to be an author. And I think there were a couple of things going on. The first was that as a little girl, I just worshiped writers, I thought they were like sages and priests and rabbis, and that they just didn't occupy the same plane as the rest of us mere mortals. And I think imagining that for myself was difficult for me. But also I come from a really blue collar background, where earning a living is front and center all the time. And things like, writing or painting or acting are hobbies, right? They're things you squeeze in around the edges of your life. And in fact, for most of the time I was writing Valentine, I was squeezing it in around the edges of my life. I was working and raising my son and being a friend, right? And living the life that I apparently had to live to be smart enough to write this book, because I think that if I had written this book, if I'd tried to write this book at 25, I don't think it would have worked. I don't think it would have been as good. And I know that there are plenty of writers out there who write these beautiful, fully formed, moving novels at the age of 25. But let me tell you, I was not one of them. I really had to go out in the world and learn some lessons the hard way, and learn to be in the world, and really learn to look at the world through, a lens of compassion and kindness and love, and particularly to look at my hometown through that lens.
Let's take a look at your journey to becoming a New York Times best-selling author and being published. So first of all, did you ever feel or ever worry that nothing would come of your book, and then, you just put it off to the side, sell a couple copies, and then go, write another book?
Not only did I think that, but there were years when I despaired of even being able to finish the damn thing, and there were so many, I know people talk about those dark nights of the writer's soul, and I would put some of mine up against anyone's. You reach 30 and you haven't finished your book or sold it, and you reach 40 and you reach 45, and all these, and every year you think, it's time to set this dream aside, right? And the only thing that kept me in the seat, the only thing that kept me working on this book, to be honest with you, was every time I truly thought about giving up on this book and giving up on these characters, it just broke my heart. It really did. Every time I thought about just leaving these characters and letting them die on the page and not bringing their stories to the world, I would just feel this kind of sorrow, this kind of deep aching sorrow. And it was enough to keep me there. But yes, that being said, no, I thought the book would come out very quietly. And that would be that. And I would, I wrote a couple of collections of short stories while I was working on this. So I was planning to go back to those. And, when in the weeks before the book came out, I was dusting off my resume. Because I'd been cobbling together a living doing freelance editing for a really long time, and I felt like I needed to get a little, at 52, I made the decision to get a little more stability in my life. So
I want you to take us to the day that you got the letter or the phone call, because first of all, for those who don't know, HarperCollins, oh my gosh, that's huge. It's not Joe Schmo Publishing, right? So did you take us to that day when you got picked up? Did you get a call? Did you get a letter? What happened?
It was shocking. So I got the book to my agent in early August, and of course I had dawdled on the last few weeks of it. We had wanted it to go out in June-ish, but I dawdled. I couldn't hand it off to her. It just wasn't quite there. So I handed it off to her in early August, and I thought, well, shoot, it's August. I hear through the grapevine that nothing happens in publishing in August. So, I'm sure that no one's even going to look at this until September. But, it sold very quickly. It sold in 6 days. And yeah, it was shocking to me. And it sold, HarperCollins got it on a preempt. I didn't know what any of these things meant. For the 6 days that we were going back and forth with several different publishers and editors, I would just hang up the phone or look at an email and then immediately go to Google. What is a preempt? What is an auction? I just had no idea, and so it happened very quickly. And they got it on a preempt, and most importantly, the editor, Emily Griffin, was remarkable. And she and I had a short conversation, and I loved her immediately. And just one of those wild sort of coincidences, she had worked on a book of a dear friend of mine a few years earlier. And so while I didn't put 2 and 2 together at first, I did very quickly. And I remembered my friend talking about how she was just brilliant, just a brilliant editor. So it was kind of magical once I finally got the thing done. So.
You said earlier that you would spend time reading your book out loud to yourself. And I have to tell you that as I read the book, I found certain places that I started reading them out loud and almost could hear them in like a Julia Roberts voice, right, as the narrator narrating the parts. And I realized I'm reading, I'm seeing a movie because I'm smelling the smells, I'm hearing the sounds, I'm feeling the wind. I mean, you've written it as a movie. It could almost go right to screenplay, if you will. So have you had any bites from Hollywood?
Well, maybe everything's still very much in process. So I don't know how it's all going to turn out. So I wouldn't want to jinx anything or,
You have.
I honestly, one of the things I'm learning about this business is, that until it's not done until it's done, right? But I'm very hopeful. And I will tell you, there are a lot of writers who are very, intellectual, and their novels are really like long, complicated explorations of ideas. I'm not really that writer. I really, one of my writing teachers told me very early on, solve your problems in the world. And what he meant by that was, if you've got a character and you're trying to figure out what they're going to do next, look around the room, see what your character is seeing, ask yourself, what would this character do? And so the world is very important to me in my work, so landscape and setting, for example. And of course, that landscape of West Texas is just so singular. There's, as you know, right, there's just nothing like that part of the world anywhere you go, right? Yeah.
I mean, in some of your phraseology, I don't know if you even know this, but you were written up on a website because of your figurative language.
No.
Yeah. Called writing coach or publishing coach or something like that. And just to show what we're talking about here, here are some lines from the book with the language. She is walking home, the basketball a steady heartbeat against the sidewalk. The wind moves from window to window, a small animal sharpening its claws on the screen. She ran over and held on to me as if she were caught in a tornado, and I was the last fence post still standing. Wow. I mean, you can see, feel, hear all of that.
Yeah.
And you know who else noticed it? It's not just me, it's Ann Patchett. And that's a marvelous story. Let me give the quote here. Fierce and complex, Valentine is a novel of moral urgency and breathtaking prose. This is the very definition of a stunning debut. You want to tell quickly the story of how you got her on your book as a blurb?
Well, first I want to say she's been such a champion for the book. I mean, she's mentioned it a few times on social media, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. And of course, I love her work as well, you know, I didn't have anything to do with it, honestly. This was all just the good fortune of having an amazing publicist, Jane Byrne, who you know, has been in the business for a long time and had worked with Anne and got the book into her hands. And I guess she liked it. So yeah, I
To the
mean,
extent that she reached out to your publisher and asked them to be a blurb on the book before they were even looking for blurbs. I mean,
that's right.
that's how
Yeah.
taken she was with your book.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I can't tell you how fortunate I feel about the way this book has rolled into the world. You know, I'm so mindful every day of all the sort of good bits of fortune that, you know, have come my way with the book. It's so beyond anything I had ever imagined.
Well, and the book has garnered amazing publicity. The Today Show that Jenna Bush made it her book choice. The New York Times, the BBC, Radio New Zealand. I mean, across the world, you have had top-notch, #1 places either review you or do a story on you. It's just been remarkable. All right, are you ready to take some questions?
Sure.
Okay, before we do, I want to do one thing. I want to read my favorite line from your book, okay? Corrine would gladly explain to anybody who cared to ask, I am not a drunk. I'm just drinking all the time. There's a world of difference between the two.
I love that. And I love the way you read it. I love that line too. So.
It's wonderful. All right, well, I'm going to punch up here and let's take a question then. Let's see. So I read Valentine. So question for you. As I read Valentine, Woody Guthrie's House of Earth and Jane Smiley's 100 Years trilogy kept coming to mind. What book crossed your mind as you write? That's from Kathy Hugg. Thanks, Kathy.
Gosh, that's a great question. I can tell you the books that I aspire to while knowing that I'll never in a million years make it. James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain is in my view one of the most perfect books ever written, and certainly one of the most perfect debut books ever written. And all through that book you feel the kind of sense of urgency that this felt like a story he just had to tell. I admire deeply Luis Alberto Urrea's books, and I had read most of his books, you know, before I began the book, you know, the books that had come out, and have read his books since. I love the sort of deep tenderness with which he looks on all of his characters, even the most, you know, even the worst of them, right? Even the most deeply flawed of them. Marilyn Robinson, who was my thesis advisor at Iowa, I admire her work deeply, and I think about it often when I'm trying to think about my work as something more than the stories on the page, but maybe something that might go out into the world and make the world a little better place in some small way, you know. Show us the dignity of humanity, something that's kind of easy to forget sometime, right? How marvelous we are, we humans. You know, that's something that I got, that Marilyn Robinson very deeply influenced me with. So.
And Brooke, I'm hoping that will answer your question that you gave as well. It's very much the same. So there was somebody asked this question, they're anonymous here. Why, as a white middle-aged woman, did you decide to write the story of a teenage Latinx girl?
That's a great question. You know, well, I went back and forth on it, you know, I asked myself, you know, why not make this happen to one of the, you know, white women in the book, you know, why go here? There were a couple of reasons. The first was that I understood very early in the process that I could not write Valentine in that time and that place without at least attempting to deal with the racism pretty head on. You know, it was such a, it was such, and it still is, it's gotten better, of course, you know, but it's still something that part of the world struggles with. It is such a poison that coursed through the veins of the hometown that I knew growing up. And I have had the experience of looking at books set in the South by other white writers and marveling that they were able to write a whole novel without really attempting to tackle racism. Because the truth is that race infects everything. You know, white supremacy infects everything in towns like that. And so I knew that. And then the other reason was, and this is sad, but the other reason was in my research, I came to understand very early going through old archives that as hard a life as it was for white women and girls in Odessa in 1976, it was so much harder for women of color. And so one of the reasons that I chose to let this crime unfold the way it did was frankly because it was so very common. You know, it happened all the time. So, you know.
All right, this one comes from Dr. Ayala, and I'm going to put a little plug in here. She is the Dean of, what is it? Is it literary, fine arts, or something? She's the Dean at Eastern New Mexico University. So she's right there on there. She says that Corinne says, stories save lives. Was there ever an adult teacher who inspired you as a reader? Oh, sorry, she's just corrected me, of course, as a teacher, liberal arts and sciences. That's what she's Dean of. A 30-year transplant in West Texas. That's where she is now. I feel like I know the landscape of each of these women personally. Many of them are my students and my neighbors. So was there an adult or a teacher who inspired you?
Yes, there were a lot. And in fact, Corinne is very loosely based on a high school English teacher who meant a lot to me. And of course, college, you know, professors, a number of them, and other people who weren't teachers in any formal sense. You know, I have learned as much about writing and living and art from women I waited tables with, you know, landlords, people I, you know, met on the street and had a conversation with. You know, I think if you move through your life as an artist with an open heart, right? And I think that's really essential to make art. You know, you learn lessons all the time, and you learn them from all kinds of people. So yes, there have been every day I encounter a teacher if I'm doing it right. You know, I'm learning a lot from my 15-year-old son right now, you know, so.
Another anonymous question here, but I think it's an important one. There is a big dollop of rage in the book. What was it like to access that depth of feeling and to live with that?
Yeah. Well, it turns out I'm pretty good at rage. I was joking with a friend the other day that sometimes these days I think that rage and mineral water are about the only things keeping me alive. So rage is something. It's an emotion I'm familiar with, and I'm deeply familiar with how destructive it is if not sort of, you know, turned in the proper, you know, if not channeled in the proper ways. And I consider art making to be a proper way to deal with rage. But it came to me after several drafts. It took me a long time to understand how pissed off these women really were and why, you know, and so, you know, I really had to take that book through several drafts before I could really understand, you know, how mad they were and some of the things that enraged them, you know, becoming a mom at 16 and not being able to finish high school, right? You know, growing up in a place with deeply, embedded notions of what was possible for you, right? In one of my favorite chapters, this young woman, Jenny Pierce, who's leaving her hometown forever and leaving her daughter behind, says to her grandmother that, you know, she wants to see beauty, right? She wants to explore the idea of beauty in her life. And her grandmother says to her, beauty is not for people like us, right? You know, and so so that's, you know, rage was, and I'm glad to hear people talking about rage in this book. Because you know, I've been surprised when people haven't wanted to talk about rage, because to me it's just on every page, you know, it's just all over this book, you know.
And somebody who started to write a question but didn't make it into the question answer box was, did you ever at any point in time consider an alternate ending?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I worked on that ending a lot. And in fact, the last 3 paragraphs of the book, I changed in editing. So we were all the way into editing, and it had never felt, you know, the ending of a book is such a thing, right? You know, you're like, this is my last chance. It has to be perfect, you know. And I had never felt like 100% okay with the last 3 or 4 paragraphs, but I couldn't ever figure out why. And it felt like it was an organic ending. So why didn't I love it, right? And then finally, you know, very late in the process, I realized what the problem was. I won't tell you because I don't want to give too much away. But yes, and those the last 3 chapters actually, you know, I had imagined different endings for all of them, and they, you know, they changed, you know.
One of the endings, and again, I don't want to give anything away, was almost a throwaway, but it was a critical one. And it was right near the end of the book. And I thought, interesting that she didn't focus very much on that, because that really wasn't the story,
Right.
you know, about what happened to him. Right. Yeah, exactly. All right. So 2 more questions because we're running out of time. And we didn't even get into this whole concept of women's violence against women and discrimination, which would be a whole thing for your book clubs, ladies. If you have them, please consider it to have Beth with you. But one of the ones, because we do have some women who are writers in this group, how did you go about finding an agent? That would seem to be very challenging at your age also.
Well, I will tell you, I'm not a good person to ask because I got very, very lucky. My agent saw one of my short stories in a literary journal and sort of tracked me down. So I was incredibly lucky. Yeah.
So the answer to that is always be writing.
Right, and don't overlook these literary journals as excellent places for excerpts of your work or your short stories to come out, you know, or your poems or whatever, for sure. Yeah.
All right, and Patricia Lucy has our final question, which of course is on all of our minds. Is there another book coming?
Yes, and I'm hoping it will not take me 14 years. So I have a lot of material. I have a lot of material that did not make it into Valentine. Actually, about 10 years worth of material that did not make it into the final draft of this book. So yes, and of course I've got some short stories as well that I'm hoping to get a couple of collections of short stories out very soon. So.
All right, so one final thing, especially for those who have not read it, what is the one thing that you hope that people will take from this book after they read it?
Oh gosh, that's an amazing question. I guess no matter who you are or where you're from, you know, or how you see yourself or don't see yourself, we are all capable of stepping up to the plate and being enormously heroic when the time calls for it. And I can't think of any time that calls for it more than right now, actually. So I guess that would be the takeaway, you know, and our lives and our lives wherever we're from, whatever our stories are, have dignity and are worthy of art making.
Yeah, we all have courage. Okay, and of course you will come back sometime?
I would love to.
Okay. All right. That's going to be it for us. Now, if you want to know more about Beth, you can go to elizabethwetmore.com. If you'd like to know more about our friend Terry and Creating Conversations, you can go to creatingconversations.org, or for more about literary women, go to literarywomen.org. Thank you again to Creating Conversations and to Literary Women for creating this conversation with Beth. Thank you, Beth.
Very quickly, just say, I think I've thanked everyone, but those of you who attended, thank you very much. And those of you who bought the book, thank you, or thinking about buying the book. I know that for a lot of us, money is super tight right now with everything that's going on. And I am grateful to you for buying Valentine and reading it. It means the world to me, and it means a lot to my family too. So thank you.
And thank you, Terry, for helping to making this all happen and put it together. And don't forget to get the signed book plates. But off to you, Terry.
I just want to add my thanks to everyone for coming. I will tell you that we are seeing book sales come through during this event. So that's very gratifying. We do appreciate it. Everyone here has volunteered their time to be here. I want to thank Pam for doing an amazing job of interviewing Beth. And Beth, what can I say? We adore you. Thanks to all of you. I know Mary Elizabeth pasted a link to the book in chat. And thanks to everybody. have a
We look
really
forward to
nice
doing this
evening.
again. Yes? Will we do something like this again, Terry?
I hope so.
Okay.
Good
so
night,
just-
everybody.
Terry, thank you so much.
Bye.
Pam, that was amazing. Thank you. That was so great. I really appreciate it. So Terry, I'm so grateful to you for hosting me. It means the world to me. Thank you.
I'm going to say from Literary Women, we're thrilled with the collaboration, and with Pam, you're such a pro, and Elizabeth, Beth, we couldn't have asked for more in an author. Thank you for being so personable.
Yeah, I hope to see all of you in real life sometime soon and have a margarita or a glass of wine.
Hello, a salty dog.